For millions around the world, Pope Francis was more than a religious leader. He was a symbol of humility, compassion, and moral clarity. His legacy is one of profound simplicity, an unwavering commitment to living as Christ did, in service to others rather than for personal gain. Behind the papal robes, the public appearances, and the monumental responsibilities he carried as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, there was a man who had spent decades shaping his own life around values that would ultimately define his papacy, and, in the end, leave behind a powerful message to the world. At his funeral, tens of thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square, a sea of mourners paying their respects to one of the most influential figures in modern history. Among those present was Maria Elena Bergoglio, Pope Francis's sister, who stood by the coffin of her brother, once Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a man who had risen from humble beginnings in Buenos Aires to become the leader of the global Catholic Church. Yet, as Maria Elena clutched her brother's will and read the final lines, her voice trembling, it became clear that what Pope Francis had left behind was not wealth, power, or influence. What he had left behind was something far more precious, a moral legacy built on faith, sacrifice, and simplicity. Early life in Flores, the foundations of faith. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born on December 17, 1936, in the working-class neighborhood of Flores in Buenos Aires, Argentina. His family, of Italian immigrant descent, lived a modest life, neither rich nor destitute. His father, Mario Bergoglio, worked as a railway accountant, while his mother, Regina Maria Sivori, was a quiet but disciplined homemaker. As the eldest of 5 children, Jorge learned responsibility early on. In a household where money was tight and every penny had to be saved, he became accustomed to frugality and hard work. His early years in Buenos Aires were far from glamorous. They were marked by an awareness of life's struggles, but also by a deep sense of care for others. Jorge was not a child defined by privilege, but rather by empathy. Even as a young boy, he had an innate ability to listen to others, whether it was a friend, a stranger, or a family member, and offer them comfort. This gift of listening would become one of the cornerstones of his later ministry. In his youth, he enjoyed playing football, soccer, with his friends in the streets of Buenos Aires, and was an avid supporter of the local team, San Lorenzo. Music was another passion, and he found joy in singing and playing guitar. These simple joys of youth were shaped by his desire to experience life in all its richness, but they were also the foundation of a future that would unfold in ways few could predict. Despite his love for football and music, Jorge never envisioned a life of religious vocation. After high school, he pursued studies in chemical engineering and worked in a laboratory. To support himself, he worked a variety of jobs. He was a bouncer at a local nightclub and also took on housekeeping work for a family. These years, spent far from the world of the clergy, gave him a deeper understanding of human struggles, independence, and the realities of living in an often unforgiving world. The turning point: a call to serve. However, in 1958, at the age of 21, Jorge experienced a pivotal moment that would change the course of his life forever. He made a confession at a small church, and during this sacrament, he felt an overwhelming sense of divine presence. It was a moment of profound spiritual awakening. Jorge felt as though he was being called to a higher purpose, one that was not aligned with the world he had known as a young man. Despite his mother's strong opposition to the idea of him joining the priesthood, Jorge made the decision to enter the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. This decision marked a significant turning point in his life. It meant cutting ties with his secular aspirations, including his career in chemical engineering, and embarking on a path that would ultimately lead him to the papacy. Jorge's journey into religious life was not one of grandiose displays, but rather a humble acceptance of a call to serve. He entered the Jesuit seminary, where he began his theological studies and training to become a priest. In 1969, after years of study and spiritual development, he was ordained as a priest. Challenges and lessons. During Argentina's political turmoil, by 1973, Jorge had become provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina, a position of considerable responsibility during a tumultuous time in the country's history. Argentina was in the midst of political turmoil, with the military regime violently suppressing dissent. The government's brutal tactics included kidnapping and torturing intellectuals, dissidents, and even priests who spoke out against the regime. Jorge faced immense challenges during this period. He had to navigate a treacherous political landscape while also maintaining his commitment to his religious values. This period was marked by fear, silence, and incredible personal sacrifice. Jorge was accused of collaborating with the regime, though there was no evidence to substantiate this claim. Yet it was during this time of immense struggle that he learned the power of silence, patience, and standing firm in one's beliefs. The experience shaped his character in ways that would later influence his approach to the papacy. In times of suffering, Jorge found strength in his faith and grew into the kind of leader who would later call on the world to embrace humility, compassion, and justice. Archbishop of Buenos Aires, a life of simplicity. In 1998, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was named Archbishop of Buenos Aires. True to his character, he chose to live simply, despite the many privileges that came with his position. He refused to live in the Archbishop's palace, instead opting to live in a small, modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. There, he cooked his own meals, did his own laundry, and traveled by bus, much like the people he served. His lifestyle was a direct reflection of his core belief that religious leaders should not live above their congregations, but should walk alongside them. When Jorge became a cardinal in 2001, he continued to live with minimal possessions, bringing only a small suitcase to the Vatican. His humility and refusal to indulge in the comforts afforded to someone of his stature set him apart from the many other high-ranking church officials who lived in opulence. His actions were not about making a statement, but about living authentically according to his values. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was not a man defined by status or wealth, but by his unshakable commitment to a life of service to others. The election of Pope Francis, a break from tradition. When Pope Benedict XVI resigned in 2013, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected as his successor. He chose the name Francis, a reference to Saint Francis of Assisi, who had given up his wealth and status to serve the poor and the marginalized. This was a clear and deliberate statement that he would not follow in the footsteps of his predecessors, who had lived in luxury and privilege. Instead, he would continue his mission to live simply, with a focus on humility and service to others. Pope Francis's choice to live in the Casa Santa Marta rather than the luxurious papal apartments, and his decision to drive a humble Fiat 500 were not gestures meant to garner praise. Rather, they were a reflection of his deeply held beliefs about the role of a pope. He was not a monarch or a figurehead of power. He was a servant of the people, called to guide the church and the world in a time of great challenge. A legacy of moral clarity and global responsibility. One of the hallmarks of Pope Francis's papacy was his ability to address the world's most pressing issues from a moral and ethical perspective. In 2015, he published Laudato Si, a document calling for humanity to reconsider its relationship with the environment. In this groundbreaking encyclical, Pope Francis argued that the destruction of the Earth was not merely a scientific issue, but a moral one, and that the poorest people in the world were the most affected by environmental degradation. Pope Francis also published Fratelli Tutti, a document focused on promoting fraternity and dialogue across different religious, ethnic, and ideological divides. The document called for a world where trust and understanding were prioritized over conflict and division. His efforts to heal centuries-old divisions between Catholics, Muslims, and Orthodox Christians were monumental, and his advocacy for interfaith dialogue was welcomed by leaders around the world. Perhaps one of his most prescient and timely documents was Dilexit Deus, in which he addressed the dangers of unchecked technological advancement. Pope Francis warned about the rise of artificial intelligence and the potential for technology to replace human beings, creating a world that lacked moral clarity and empathy. He described this as a crisis of moral silence, emphasizing the need for humanity to retain its ethical compass as it advanced into the future. The Pope's humble beginnings, a life shaped by simplicity. To understand why these instructions felt like a treasure to Maria Elena, it is essential to look back on the life of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the man who would become Pope Francis. Born in the working-class neighborhood of Flores, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, his life was never one of luxury. His family, of Italian immigrant descent, lived a modest existence. His father, a railway worker, and his mother, a dedicated housewife, instilled in him values of hard work, responsibility, and simplicity. Jorge's early years were marked by a profound sense of duty and an ever-present awareness of the needs of others. As the eldest of 5 children, he quickly learned the importance of self-discipline and taking care of those around him. While many children in Buenos Aires dreamed of wealth and fame, Jorge's attention was focused on others, listening to their struggles, empathizing with their pain. Even as a teenager, he was a listener, drawn to the emotions of those around him, including strangers. His love for football and music was shared with friends in the streets of Buenos Aires, but his academic dedication was unwavering, particularly in his pursuit of a degree in chemical engineering. However, it was not the pursuit of worldly success that defined his path. After high school, he worked in a laboratory, lived an ordinary life, and even worked as a bouncer at a nightclub and as a housekeeper to earn extra money. These jobs were far from the calling of a priest, but they offered him valuable insights into the lives of ordinary people and the struggles they faced. A life-changing decision. The turning point. At the age of 21, Jorge experienced a moment that would forever change his life. After a routine confession in a small church, he was struck by a deep sense of calling, a profound spiritual awakening that transcended anything he had ever experienced. It was at this moment that he decided to leave behind his secular life and embrace the priesthood. His mother, a devout woman herself, did not fully support his decision, but Jorge's conviction was unshakable. This was the beginning of his journey, one that would lead him far beyond the streets of Buenos Aires to the highest office of the Catholic Church. In 1969, after years of study and reflection, Jorge Bergoglio was ordained as a priest. From that moment forward, his life became intertwined with the Church, yet his commitment to simplicity and humility remained steadfast. The call to serve, upholding values, in times of turmoil. In 1973, Jorge faced one of the most challenging periods of his life. Argentina was in the throes of political upheaval, and the military junta that ruled the country was engaged in widespread persecution of dissidents. Many priests, intellectuals, and activists were abducted, tortured, and killed during this time, and Bergoglio himself found himself under scrutiny. He became the provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina, a position that required him to make difficult decisions in a time of great danger. Bergoglio's ability to navigate this turbulent period without compromising his beliefs was a testament to his strength of character. He witnessed firsthand the brutality of the regime, but rather than retreat into silence, he chose to stand firm in his faith. It was here that he began to understand the true cost of standing up for what is right, the price of silence, patience, and moral integrity. A pope who walked among the people. In 1998, Jorge Bergoglio was appointed Archbishop of Buenos Aires. Despite the authority that came with this position, he continued to live in the same humble manner he had always known. He refused to move into the episcopal palace, opting instead to live in a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. He cooked his own meals, did his own laundry, and took public transportation. To the people of Buenos Aires, he was known simply as the Bishop. Even when he was made a cardinal in 2001, his lifestyle remained unchanged. When the 2005 papal conclave took place, Bergoglio was considered a strong contender for the papacy. However, he chose to withdraw his name from consideration in the final round. It was a selfless act, one that reflected his deep commitment to service over personal ambition. When he was elected Pope in 2013, after the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI, he took the name Francis, a clear sign of his devotion to humility and service. The Pope's radical simplicity, a challenge to the Vatican elite. Pope Francis's ascension to the papacy was marked by a radical shift in how the papacy would be perceived. His choice to live in the Casa Santa Marta, rather than the luxurious papal apartments, and his decision to drive a Fiat 500 rather than a limousine immediately set him apart from his predecessors. For many, this was a sign that Pope Francis was not simply adhering to a persona of humility for show. This was who he was, at his core. For decades, those who knew Jorge Bergoglio in Buenos Aires spoke of his unwavering commitment to simplicity. And now the world saw that same man in the Vatican. His refusal to live in opulence was not a political statement, it was a personal choice, rooted in his lifelong desire to serve others rather than indulge in luxury. A moral legacy, not just words, but action. Pope Francis's tenure as Pope was defined by his commitment to making the Church more accountable to the world's most pressing issues. His public statements and actions reflected a deep concern for the poor, the environment, and the moral future of humanity. In 2015, he published Laudato Si, an encyclical that called for urgent action on climate change. His words were a moral challenge to the global community, urging humanity to reconsider its relationship with nature. In Fratelli Tutti, 2020, Pope Francis took the bold step of calling for global brotherhood, urging people to embrace differences in faith, culture, and ideology as opportunities for dialogue, not division. His approach to social issues, including the treatment of refugees and the environment, earned him both praise and criticism. Yet, he remained steadfast, not swayed by the pressures of public opinion, but guided by his moral convictions. The crisis of integrity, challenges and controversies. Despite his profound impact, Pope Francis's papacy was not without its controversies. The 2018 Chilean sexual abuse scandal rocked the Church, and Pope Francis initially defended a bishop accused of covering up the abuse. The backlash was swift, and Pope Francis admitted his mistake, commissioning an independent investigation and accepting the resignation of Chile's bishops. While his actions were seen as a positive step, the damage to his reputation was undeniable. Socially, his stance on same-sex couples also attracted criticism. By blessing same-sex couples but refusing to endorse same-sex marriage, he alienated both conservative and progressive factions. Yet, His insistence on the importance of love for all, regardless of sexual orientation, became a hallmark of his papacy. Financially, Pope Francis took bold steps to reform the Vatican's finances, tackling corruption and transparency issues head-on. These actions made him enemies within the Church, and rumors spread about hidden wealth or ulterior motives. However, Pope Francis never wavered from his commitment to ensure that the Church would not be a bastion of wealth and power. A legacy of kindness. The Pope's final years. As Pope Francis's health declined, the whispers of conspiracy and calls for his resignation grew louder. He faced these challenges with the same resolve that had defined his papacy. He understood that the cost of integrity was not just external criticism, but internal loneliness. The loneliness of a leader who chose the hard path of truth rather than the easy road of compromise. In his final years, Francis's influence remained strong, not just in the Church, but across the world. His legacy, however, would not be measured in documents or financial reforms. It was in the way people remembered him, not for the policies he enacted, but for the way he lived, for the personal warmth and compassion he showed to all he encountered. The quiet conclusion. A legacy beyond wealth. At the funeral of Pope Francis, the world stood still in a moment of collective reflection. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the globe, held candles and shared stories of the man who had touched their hearts. The most repeated phrase of the night was simple: "You lived as you believed." Pope Francis's life had not been about creating grand legacies or building monuments. It was about living truthfully, authentically, and for others. Maria Elena, as she read the will, understood the profound simplicity of the legacy Pope Francis had left behind. It was not a legacy of material wealth or inherited titles. It was a legacy of principles, values, and a call to live with kindness, compassion, and integrity. Values that his family and the world would carry forward, not as a burden, but as a gift.